Now it is my pleasure to introduce today's speaker. As Regulatory Services Regional Manager for the Global Technical Resources Group at UL, Andrew Farhat strategically examines regulatory changes to assess impact on the business operations of consumer product retailers, manufacturers, distributors, and suppliers. Through targeted research and analysis, Andrew works with clients to implement value-added solutions to meet the requirements of evolving legislation. Actively involved in the quality assurance industry for over 10 years, Andrew has experience in a broad range of consumer products, including toys, textiles and apparel, and general merchandise. Andrew is a member of the American Apparel and Footwear Association, the American Society for Testing and Materials International, the International Organization for Standardization, and the Toy Industry Association. And now I will turn the presentation over to Andrew.
Thank you very much, Kim. Thank you, everybody, and welcome. Today's presentation, as Kim alluded to earlier, is going to be about hazard identification. So the agenda is quite short. The material is probably going to take us around a half hour, so we're going to have plenty of time for questions if anyone does have questions. And so within the agenda, we're going to look at 4 different things. We're going to start by looking at mitigating your risk or trying to minimize risk. And when we talk about hazards, we're looking at hazards in a variety of ways, and ultimately trying to minimize hazard, therefore minimizing risk. So we're going to look at not just the risk, we're going to look at human factors, and that is how humans interact with products, how they use them, how they dispose of them, and that's a really big idea in terms of the exposure and how much hazard there is and the risk. That all works together, the human factors plus the hazard. We're going to talk about anthropometrics, which is just the physiological aspects of the body, and looking forward to see what's on the horizon here. So from hazard identification, there's a lot of industry concerns. And here are some of them. I mean, honestly, products are often intended to be used by adults, but in a lot of situations, they end up in the hands of children. And that happens all the time. I mean, it could happen at trade shows or workplaces. You know, at trade shows, maybe you're given a stress ball. You squeeze it. It looks nice. You might give it to your child. The intent of that item was not to go to the child. It was an adult item, but it happens to get into the hands of a child. That's just one big concern the industry has. Determining whether a product is actually a general use product for adult usage or a children's product is another big concern, and it's actually a very subjective aspect of all this. Looking at a product and deciding, is it a children's product or is it an adult? And there's a lot of factors that go into that, human factors being one of them. And then ultimately, whose responsibility is it to determine if a product is in fact a children's product? And I think ultimately that really the importer of record, whoever is the manufacturer bringing that product in, it's their responsibility as they're the ones producing it for the end user. And they're going to know who their target audience is. So that's a big concern, in identifying and whose responsibility is it to identify when it is a children's product. Product recalls, obviously they happen all the time. And just because you meet regulatory requirements does not really indemnify you for potential recalls. And a lot of times, recalled products, they meet every single regulatory requirement within that jurisdiction. However, they still pose some form of hazard and ultimately are recalled. And I have a few examples up here, and the one on the left are these really small, they look like little pills, they're magnets. And these magnets found were loosened from the actual plastic. They became a small part. Children swallowed these. Some children had some serious injuries, and even some died off of this. And ultimately, this is a good example. All 3 of these are good examples of hazards that, as toys and children's products evolve and become more complex and more creative, new hazards begin to be found. No one really thought that these magnets were hazardous until, oops, they started falling out and there was issues. Same thing with the product in the middle. Those look like, they almost look like little nails. Well, based on the shape of those nails and the length of them, there's a lot of aspiration hazards. They can get lodged in the throat. And so that was a hazard that not many people identified, but later was identified, and the toy standard in the U.S. was modified for that. The items on the right are hemispherical shaped objects. They have a tendency, depending on the diameter, they can go over your nose and mouth and cause suffocation. So there's a lot of, no one would think, a lot of these are what they call latent hazards. You don't really know that the hazard exists, but it is there. And a lot of times those latent hazards aren't identified and caught in regulatory requirements until it's too late. Even adult products get recalled quite frequently. And to be quite honest, it could be something as simple as a mug on the right there. That mug could be, the curing process for that mug might not have been perfectly done. It retains moisture, and if ceramic ware retains moisture, it has a tendency to get very hot coming out of the microwave. So you could have issues where a ceramic mug just gets ultra hot with very little usage in the microwave, poses a really big hazard. Those have been recalled in the past. It could be the chandelier on the left, and that that type of chandelier. There aren't that many mandatory requirements for that, but there are voluntary requirements, both CSA and UL voluntary standards for luminaires such as this. And if it doesn't meet some of those requirements, sometimes they pose hazards and they get recalled. So recalls do, have issues. Recalls happen for both adult and children's, and typically, obviously, a lot more children's products tend to be recalled because they're much more heavily regulated. But recalls do happen for adult products as well. I'm going to read this because I think this is quite interesting. So CPSC, that's the Consumer Product Safety Commission, that's the regulating body in the United States. This is the recommendation. It says the safety of a product depends upon many factors. One factor is building safety into the product design. And really that's looking at the design of that product, identifying potential hazards at the design stage to then design those hazards out so that when it's finished, you're not going to have any issue. And I'll continue reading. It says, the ability of manufacturers to recognize and anticipate these factors is central to the effective design and production of safe products. It's really looking at the actual human factors aspect of that. And so they're saying not only do you want to look at the design of that product, but you want to look at how the humans interact or how the intended user of that product is going to interact with that product. And that will give you a very good way of anticipating if these any hazards are going to be even more magnified depending on the usage of that product. So when we talk about reducing our risk or mitigating the risk, we can look at multiple ways of reducing our risk. First and foremost, we can look at the regulatory requirements. We can assure that our product meets those requirements, and to have an overall quality assurance program, an overall program to ensure that your products not only meet those regulatory requirements, but meets your own safety requirements and your own requirements for your brand that you want to ensure. And this could be from testing, this could be from inspections and inspecting product, but it's an overall quality assurance program that will mitigate all your regulatory requirements. You want to look at the age analysis. You want to determine the appropriate age. And there's a lot of material on this, looking at the anthropomorphic data from children, the developmental aspects of different children at different ages. It allows manufacturers or the designers to properly give it the age grade to that product that's the appropriate age grade for that product to be used. And by doing so, you are educating the consumer, so when they're out shopping or they're out looking for a product, they can look and identify, I'm buying it for a 5-year-old, so I'm going to look at products that are appropriate for 5-year-olds, and they're going to use that age grade to help them determine the appropriate items for their children or whatnot. And ultimately, that's critical in reducing risk, because if you mis-age grade it and you misrepresent it, and what you think is a 8-year-old plus toy, but really is an all ages toy, there's going to be hazards in an 8+ toy that are very bad for a 2-year-old. And so that's the key, is properly age grading the product. We talked about design evaluation, but that's looking at the design of that product, looking at it above and beyond what the regulations ask for. So when we do that type of design evaluation, we're looking for latent hazards that are not really identified in the actual regulations. And so this goes above and beyond regulatory. You also have the ability to look at recalls and injury analysis. So there's lots of data out there. Whether you're in the US or in Canada, there's a lot of injury data and recall data that you could utilize to look for trends and to identify hazards based off of injury data that you see. And hospitals and medical practitioners, all their data is captured, and you're able to query that data. It's called NICE data here in the U.S. You're able to find that data, and you're able to see some trends in some injuries and being able to identify potential hazards that way. And then the manufacturing controls, that works in conjunction with the quality assurance program that I talked about at the top point there. But that's putting in place controls at the manufacturer, at the factory level, where you're going to define and you're going to document what your requirements are and what you expect from that factory when they're making the product for you. All of this works all hand in hand together, and all of these have, in one way or another, assist in reducing the risk of your product. There are lots of different hazard identification tools. There's standard available checklists. So ISO Guide 50 is an interesting guide. So is the Canadian Safety Requirements for Children's Toys Guide. These guides list off different hazards, whether they're mechanical hazards or thermal hazards or flammability hazards, and they have a list of them. So you can look, and I'm not going to go through this whole list here, but you can see, based off of Guide 50 here, they have gaps and openings, protrusions. You're looking at corners and edges, the different heights, noise levels. So you're looking at, these are the types of hazards, and ultimately you can utilize this when looking at your design, making sure that you identify if any of these hazards do exist, and utilizing it to eliminate those hazards. This is a decision tree. So upon identifying, this is how you look at it from a decision tree, I should say. Let me take a step back. So if you look at that decision tree on the right, it talks about defining the intended use and reasonable foreseeable misuse of that product. You can identify the hazard. You can estimate the risk of that hazard, and that's part of the risk analysis. And then you ultimately come up with a risk assessment saying, I do not think there's much risk here, or there is risk. And then depending on the amount of risk you find, you have to make a decision. Is that amount of risk acceptable or not acceptable? But this is the decision tree that you start with. And so ISO Guide 51, and there's European guides for this, is a top-down method of analyzing a series of foreseeable events with a consumer product. And it helps you go step by step from identifying the use and misuse to identifying hazards to looking at the exposure and the risk of it, and then deciding from that, is this acceptable or not to you? There are other hazard identification tools that can be utilized, including FMEA, that stands for Failure Mode and Effects Analysis. And there are, once again, European guidelines on this, but ultimately this is a process of systematically identifying hazards to determine the outcome and the potential outcome of the risk. So if we look at this, and I really like this slide because there's a lot in here, and I don't want to talk it too much, but it's worth really diving deeper into the slide. You can look at on the chart on the left with the red and the yellow and the orange. You can look at the severity of the injury on the top right from 4 to 1 in terms of the severity. And then on the left column, you can almost look at the probability of potential injury or damage being done during the lifetime of a product. And it goes from almost certain to impossible if that's going to happen. So when you look at a severe, 4 being the highest severity, if you have a very severe injury potential and it's almost for surely going to happen, you have what they call S, which is a serious risk. And so utilizing this kind of matrix approach, you're able to look at, hey, if it's really not possible, if there's a very low likelihood or a very low probability of damage or an injury occurring, and the risk is low, it's a low risk. It's quite simple. And when you look at risk, you look at hazard times exposure, and this is exactly what we're looking at here. The hazard being high, the exposure being high, then the risk is very high. And so this gives you a really interesting look at where you can identify where there's a serious risk versus a low risk. And here are more of the definitions. When you look at severity of injury from 1 to 4, it gives you detailed information about what would constitute a score of a 1 for a severity of injury versus what would constitute a score of a 4 for the severity of injury. And then we also blew up on the right there what the probability of damage is in terms of the percentages of the probability percentage of that happening. So you can look at when it says virtually impossible, it's 1 out of a million 1 out of a million of that particularly happening, versus almost certain 50% of the time or greater that might happen. So you can see that's how it's broken down. But I really like this slide. So what is human factors? What is it exactly? Because, like I said, it plays a crucial role in hazard identification and identifying risk based off of that hazard. It's an area of psychology that studies the relationship between people and their environments. So that picture there is pretty wild. It's a child being transported, and it looks like a little dolly, makeshift dolly. But it's interesting to think how a consumer would use something like that. They find innovative ways to use it, and they adapt with their environment. And sometimes they're using a product and misusing it in a way that is just erroneous on so many levels. So it's a way of looking at the psychology of how humans interact with their environment and ultimately use products in some ways seriously wrong ways, depending on the environment they're in. So what are some of the goals of human factors? Well, first and foremost is to maximize the performance, which in some ways looks at enhancing the user experience. It could be the comfort and fit of it, making it just perform better than the other products. And so by looking at human factors, you might look at the ergonomics of a chair and say, well, the way an individual sits in a chair, I should put more lumbar support here, or I should do this. I should make the armrest a little bit higher, so easier on the shoulders, et cetera, et cetera. So there's ways you can utilize human factors to maximize the performance of a product. You can also look at it from minimizing errors, that is, looking at the foreseeable use and misuse of that product and saying, wow, this product, I'm intending to be used this way, but it can be used completely wrong in this manner, and it would have a serious risk of injury if it's misused that way. So you can look at it from that perspective, as well as from a safety, and I kind of alluded to that just a second ago, injury prevention, looking at how potentially being used, does it pose any safety issues? Is there any potential for injuries from the way a human or a consumer is going to actually physically interact with this product? So those are some of the big big hierarchy goals of human factors. And so who can conduct this type of work, human factors work? Well, it does take a set of specific skills to do this. So personnel with specialized skills, industrial design, child development, they are going to have the skill set and the understanding to be able to utilize how the development of children with the design of that product to ultimately utilize human factor as part of it. So it takes a certain set of skill set to do that. Not everyone can do it. To be quite honest, I'm not a child development expert myself. So it takes a specific person to do this that has a background in this. It could be someone internally. You could have someone trained. There's trainings for this. You could have someone in your company participate in ISO Guide 50 or ISO Guide 51 and really understand the human factors aspect of it, hazard identification. And they can be part of your team. That can be a critical aspect of your overall program by having someone do that. You could also have it done externally. So you could hire someone. You could hire UL or multiple different service providers who could provide some of the human factors help to you. But it's critical, and I can't stress it enough. I should have probably bolded this one and put it in red. But it is critical that it's independent from the product designer. See, because when the product designer designs these products, they are not thinking of this a lot of the times. They're not thinking about the human factors. They're making something that to them looks really cool, and they think it's a great idea. It needs to be someone to evaluate it that has no connectivity to that designer, so they can give it an objective view of this product, an objective analysis of it, almost in essence, so there's no kind of undue influence, and we've heard that term used before. So there's no influence that the designer is going to influence the human factors analysis of it. So it's important for whoever's doing this to be independent from that product designer, to really not have any interaction with them. When should you be conducting this? Well, first and foremost, at the concept stage. So when you're conceptualizing a product, there's a new idea, let's make this product. Well, let's take a step back before we dive too deep in. From a concept standpoint, we want to look at it from a human factors, from a hazard identification to see what we think of it. It could be from a sculpture or from a working model. I put engineering pilots here, so CAD drawings, or early production samples. These are all, I would say, times in the development of a product where it's critical to start analyzing the hazards, doing a human factors assessment, to really start looking at and identifying, is it worth it to continue with this design, or is it worth it to tweak it a little bit to ensure that we design these hazards out before it gets too late? Because once you get too late in the process and you've moved forward with production and now you've produced product, if you identify an issue then, you're talking about wasted time, wasted product, delays, new molds. There could be a multitude of different things, and it all comes back and it all hits the bottom line. It's a big hit, not just from a money standpoint, but it could also be from a brand standpoint. Maybe you don't catch it and it gets in the market and there's a recall, and then there's safety issues. So it's a domino reaction, chain reaction of, could be a lot of unfortunate events. So it's critical to do this early on. Some of the components of human factors review. So they're going to evaluate the concept of the product for, and it's going to look at the intended and intended users, the function of it, and the design and fit. So like I said, and a little bit of this is repeated, but it's good to hear it again. You're looking at this concept really to say, I know who the intended user is, but how can it also, what's the unintended user? Can this get into the hands of the children? Will it be appealing to children if it's not intended for children? And then looking at how it can be used, misused. How does it fit, the comfort of it, the size of it? So there's three really big aspects of part of the human factors review. I talked about really early on identifying when something is a children's product or not. And these 4 bullets here, it's not the end-all, say-all in determining if something is a children's product, but it is virtually used all the time to identify if something is a children's product or not. The first thing, the manufacturer's labeled age grade. So if I were to put on my product 6+, 6 years old up, to me, to many people, that's clearly identified as a children's product because you labeled it 6+. However, if you label something 18+, I'm not saying people do that, but that would tell me that it's not for children. You could also look at it from an advertising, promotion, or marketing standpoint. How is this product being advertised? How is it being marketed? How is it being promoted? So if I have a product and I have an advertisement, or it's in my catalog, and in my catalog I have a child holding it, that would tell me that a child is intended to use this product. So you need to be very careful on how you advertise or promote or market a product, because you may think this product is not intended for adults, but you advertise it in a way where you construe that it should be used by children. So that's another factor that they look at. The age group for whom the product is commonly recognized. So a lot of the times there's a common understanding of what certain products are intended for children or not, just by the type of product. Oh, stuffed animals, we know those are for children, but it's recognized, it's generally recognized as being for children. So that's another aspect of it. And then the last aspect of it is the age grade determination guidelines. And I talked about this a little bit earlier. There's a lot of information on this. The CPSC here in the U.S. has a very large age grade determination guideline that's utilized not just by people in the U.S. but by global markets utilize this. But really it's a breakdown of different age grades and looking at what is appealing from a physical standpoint, from a mental standpoint, from a physiological standpoint for children of different ages. For example, 3-year-olds, or I should take that back, 12 months to 18-month children, they like vibrant colors. They like softer materials. The components need to be bigger so they can actually grasp it versus smaller. They have all, depending on the physiological aspects of the child, the mental development, the cognitive development, they're looking at all those aspects of the development of the child to determine what is more suitable and more appealing to children at these different age groups. So if I'm making a product, for example, I'm selling a puzzle, and my puzzle has 20 pieces in it. and the puzzle pieces are 2 inches each. They're 2 inches. They're bigger pieces. That would be more appropriate for like a 3-year-old versus a puzzle that's of 50 pieces or 100 pieces that are much smaller pieces. Those are the things that they're looking at in this age grade determination guidelines, and that's just one broad example I gave you. But they go into really big detail for all types of products, whether they're puzzles and games, whether they're ride-on toys, with costumes and dress-up, learning, activity games. So they go. It's a very, very comprehensive age grade determination guideline. But that could be utilized to help properly identify the proper age grade of the product. And that has a big effect on whether something is a children's product or not. So looking at the foreseeable use and misuse of the product, you're going to look at it from, you're going to look at the instructions of that product. How are there instructions, and how do they instruct that product to be used? You're going to look at the look and function of that product, and you're going to look at the similarity of that to other products. So, if you have a product that's similar to another product and that can be misused, you can ultimately utilize that in determining the actual use and misuse of the product. The design and fit. So I talked about anthropometry, which is hard to pronounce, but that is looking at the height, weight, size of the children, the physical attributes of different children of different ages, and that helps and assists in the design of a product. So you're looking at certain measurements that are static, that are constant, and some measurements that are ever changing depending on the age of the child, but they utilize this to help design the product better from a performance and a fit standpoint. We all know that children will be children, and a lot of the times they're doing things that are just, they don't think are risky, but are very, very risky. And it could be in the most safe environment. It could be in a crib. But a lot of times it's not in the crib. It's happening in your living room, or it's happening in a playground. And this type of behavior has a big influence on the human factors aspect. So some of the resources I talked about and I mentioned throughout the course of this presentation, mandatory and voluntary standards. And I talked about how mandatory requirements are obviously, you must meet those mandatory requirements, but that's not the end-all say-all, and there are situations where products are recalled even when they pass all mandatory requirements. So voluntary standards are quite important. Incident data and product recalls. I talked about utilizing incident data for injuries and things of that nature to identify potential injury and risk. Product recalls kind of gives you some trends and where you see the regulators, whether it's Health Canada or the CPSC, what types of products they've been targeting. Utilizing the age grade determination guidelines, as I mentioned earlier, to help properly age grade a product. Medical resources, and I talked about that similar to incident data. And CPSC Public's database. The CPSC has something called saferproducts.gov. It's a website where anyone can lodge complaints off of consumer products. So there's a wealth of information there. There's some pretty crazy stuff there. If you have time to look at it, you can find some interesting things on there. Utilizing anthropometric data, we talked about that in terms of the design of the product. Utilizing the hazard identification tools, ISO Guide 50, 51. Looking at the development of children. Even potentially using focus groups and child observation, and we didn't talk much about that, but that's another opportunity to really look at the human factors of how a child interacts with something. So, there are observation rooms where you can put a subset of children in a room with some toys, and you can sit back and you can watch how they're interacting with these toys. And it is eye-opening to see what they do with some of these toys that you would never, ever think about unless you actually watched it happening. Also, you can utilize reviews of similar products. If there's other products in the market and there's complaints or issues or concerns about those products, then there should be a red flag for you as well. So a look forward. So once again, the EU Toy Safety Directive is in effect right now. There's a lot going on with that. We're looking at design. There's a design assessment requirements within the European Toy Safety Directive that mandate you do a design assessment looking at the overall risk of that product, not just from a design standpoint, but from a chemical standpoint. CPSC has what we call the reasonable testing program that's in effect now, but I think people are still grappling with that. It's looking at how do you continue to ensure your products meet the requirements here in the U.S. ASTM, that's the American Standards Association, they have a work group within their toy committee called Emerging Hazards. And that is really an interesting work group. It's attended by members of the CPSC. It's attended by members of Health Canada and a lot of retailers and manufacturers, and the laboratories sit on that as well. But this is where this work group really looks at hazards that aren't yet covered in any of these standards that the group feels are emerging potential hazards that need to be identified in future versions of the standard. That's a really, really good work group. And in addition, I want to mention that Health Canada is working very closely as we speak with ASTM to do their best to harmonize the toy requirements in Canada with the toy requirements here in the U.S. And there's actually a working group set up right now. It's the Canada and the ASTM alignment group. And they are now breaking out into work groups to help harmonize. So that's something to keep an eye on. And as I mentioned before, the Consumer Product Safety Database, saferproducts.gov, it's a crazy, crazy database with so much information on there. Some of it, I think you can look at it and go, wow, that's crazy that someone would say that or do. It's almost a database of just complaints. And so, but you're able to really see some trends in there, how consumers are using products and how they're misusing them. I mean, trust me, there's a lot of misuse. If you go to that database, you can see it. So that's some things to look forward to and keep looking onto. And when we talk about hazard identification, there's really 3 steps to it. 1, you want to design the hazard out of the product. 2, you want to guard or shield against that hazard. And lastly, if need be, you need to warn. And I'll be honest with you, warning doesn't always work well. So you really want to try to focus on number 1 and number 2, with the last resort being to warn if needed. So with that being said, I mean, I think I wrapped up. I said around 30 minutes. It was around 30 minutes. I couldn't have timed that better with that. If there are any questions, I'd be glad to take them now. If there are none, my email address is andrew.farhat@ul.com. I'd be more than happy to, you can send me any emails if you'd like, and any questions you have on this or any other topic that you have questions on, I'd be more than happy to help. But I'll open it up now for any live questions if there are any. I know a lot of people are typically shy at this time, so they don't like to, the questions aren't really asked too much, but I'll open it up, Kim, if there's any questions.
Hi, Andrew. We don't have any questions through the chat.
Okay.
All right.
Well, I guess with that then, I'll let everyone get a half hour of their day back instead of hearing me for another 25 minutes. Like I said, if there are any other questions, please email me, andrew.farhat@ul.com, and I'll be glad to help. But thank you all for your attention, and I really appreciate it, and have a great afternoon, everybody.
Thank you very much, Andrew. With that, we will end today's webinar, and a copy of the presentation material will be made available through PPPC. It's been our pleasure to present to you today. You may now disconnect, and thank you and have a great day.